Darfur is a region in Sudan that is currently experiencing a complex civil war and consequently is in a state of humanitarian crisis. Conflict in this region dates back to the military coup of 1989, in which General Omar al-Bashir and the National Islamic Front seized control of the state, and a period of conflict ensued due to the oppression of Darfur's non-Arab population by the new government. Unrest was heightened in 2003 as this oppression led the rebel groups of the Sudan Liberation Army and the Justice Equality Movement to initiate armed conflict against the Sudanese government. The Sudanese government responded by arming and inciting Arab ethnic groups to fight against the rebels, and by creating the militia group known as the Janjaweed that was ordered to carry out systematic attacks on villages and civilians. To date, the Janjaweed have completely devastated over 400 villages in Darfur, in which an estimated 400,000 people have lost their lives, over 2.5 million have been displaced from their homes, and over 4.7 million rely solely on humanitarian aid. These government-supported actions have been labelled as genocide by the international community, and consequently the International Criminal Court responded in 2009 by issuing an arrest warrant for President Omar al-Bashir for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Whilst the international community has strongly condemned the actions of the Sudanese government in Darfur as genocide, little has been done to restrict or prevent the actions of the government, and most states remain reluctant towards any form of intervention. The United Nations responded in 2007 with a resolution that formulated a combined United Nations and African Union peacekeeping force, known as the African Union-United Nations Hybrid Operations in Darfur, to monitor the implementation of the 2006 Darfur Peace Agreement, protect the civilians of Darfur, and improve security and access in the region for humanitarian support and peacekeepers. This mission has met serious resource challenges, along with increased non-cooperation and resistance from the government, as well as all parties breaching the conditions set out in the Darfur Peace Agreement. The success of UNAMID has been further hindered by attacks on its peacekeepers, 207 of which have been killed since 2008, along with increased restrictions by the government on access to conflict areas for peacekeepers. Currently, the UNAMID mission is made up of a total of 17,754 uniformed personnel, including 14,413 troops, predominantly made up of troops from the African Union, and costs roughly $2.6 billion per year to maintain. Since 2004, Australia has donated $82 million to UNAMID, and from 2008 to 2011 provided 8 specialist personnel in logistics, operations, and movement planning. However, both operations have now ceased. The only current humanitarian intervention in Darfur by Australia is thus the UN financial, trade and travel sanctions imposed by Australia on Sudan. The Australian government should therefore consider the below policy options, as in light of this humanitarian crisis, Australia as an international citizen has a responsibility to protect the civilians suffering such human rights abuses, a principle of international law that Australia has strongly promoted, as well as being a signatory to the United Nations Convention on Genocide, through which it has an obligation to both prevent and punish instances of genocide. The first policy option towards humanitarian intervention that the Australian government should consider is deploying Australian Defence Force troops to assist UNAMID peacekeepers in Darfur. The objective of deploying Australian troops is to assist and improve the performance of the UNAMID mission through increasing the number of military forces in the region, and thus increasing the protection of civilians and improvement of the security of the region in order to increase access for humanitarian assistance and aid. As the UNAMID force in Darfur is currently made up of 14,413 military troops, with a mandated maximum of 15,845, there is firstly room for Australian troops to assist this force on the ground. Similarly, as only 2,171 of an estimated total of 76,846 full-time members of the Defence Force are currently involved in international operations, the Australian Defence Force therefore has the capability to send such assistance. The Australian Defence Force is also financially capable of deploying a force of around 400 troops, as based on estimates of costing $670,000 per person, it would cost only $268 million out of the current defence budget of $31.9 billion. This is an affordable cost in comparison to the potential humanitarian assistance and protection of civil rights that this assistance could achieve. While the Australian involvement in the UNIMID mission may, however, face resistance from the Sudanese government, given the necessity of the crisis, it is recommended the Australian government deploys around 400 military personnel to assist with the mission. The second policy option is the creation of a task force to train and assist defence forces of the largest contributors to UNIMID, with the objective to improve the success and ability of the UNIMID peacekeepers. The countries that would benefit the most from such training, as the three largest African Union contributing states, include Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. This would require a task force of 60 specialist personnel, with the expert ability and experience in weapons, tactical, and logistics to assist each country. Australia is capable of providing this number of troops, as based on the above averages, it would cost around $40,000, and as the Australian Defence Force has the required personnel to implement such training, highlighted through its current training operations in Afghanistan. It is therefore recommended that 20 personnel be sent to each country to train their UNIMID forces in order to improve the effectiveness of the peacekeeping mission. The third policy option is a coalition-based military intervention into Darfur, with the objective to protect citizens and increase the security of the region through the allowed use of force, to facilitate political negotiations between the government and the rebel movements. Australia would be capable of such military intervention only if it is coalition-based, as Australia does not have the resources to commit to an independent intervention. This could be with an established military coalition like NATO, with the African Union, or with a singular powerful state. Australia would be able to commit around 2,000 forces to such an operation, but any larger number would not be viable given the defence budget. Such an operation would protect civilians in ways that the peacekeeping missions cannot, with the use of force against militia groups that are partaking in the violent atrocities. The implementation of no-fly zones monitored by strong air defence to restrict the movements of government and militia forces, along with cutting off their external support and supplies, the protection of borders and internally displaced people's camps, along with covert operations to apprehend the President to be trialled by the ICC, would be effective measures that an alliance-based force would be capable of carrying out. It is therefore recommended that the Australian Defence Force establish a force of 2,000 personnel to be deployed in a bilateral or multilateral military intervention into Darfur. Whilst the presence of such an intervention would be ill received by the Sudanese government, the objective to facilitate a political agreement may be achieved by the threat and presence of such a military force. The final policy option is military inaction, with the objective to facilitate a political agreement between the Sudanese government and the rebel movements without the deployment of any members of the Australian Defence Force. This option would cost Australia the least, as it involves no movement of ADF troops and would only require a small number of personnel, if any. Australia may send a special envoy to assist the African Union or UNIMID to facilitate political negotiations between the conflicting factions, in order to reach an agreement that could be more effectively implemented than the current Darfur peace agreement. Australia could also increase its current sanctions on Sudan in order to achieve such negotiations and to coerce the government to restrict and completely stop militia activities. Our sanctions currently predominantly only preclude the exportation, supply, or training of arms or weapon-related materials, and thus could easily be expanded. It is therefore recommended that Australia could have strong involvement with UNIMID and the African Union in facilitating peace talks and to help coerce such negotiations through increased sanctions. In light of the drastic extent of the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, it is therefore essential that the Australian government considers the implementation of one of these described policies in order to protect the civilians of Darfur from any further suffering.